Getting jacked for BJJ will improve your performance. It will make you stronger, have a protective effect on your joints, and reduce your risk of injury. Here is a beginner's guide to getting jacked for BJJ. We'll be discussing the benefits of increasing your muscle size for jiu-jitsu, a brief look at the science behind muscle hypertrophy best practices, and how to adapt them for jiu-jitsu, a summary of everything that we went over, and where to go next, and some resources. The benefits of increasing your muscle size for jiu-jitsu. Larger muscles usually means healthier bodies. It also improves your sports performance because larger muscles is associated with more strength. Jiu-jitsu performance is no exception to this benefit. If you can agree with the fact that strength improves your performance on the jiu-jitsu mats, a byproduct of that, increasing your muscle size, will increase your strength, thus improve your performance as well. Muscle loss is very common as you age. So by doing some form of hypertrophy or strength training, you're reducing that rate of decline, and you can even reverse it, stop it in its tracks, and have muscle growth as you age. Not only that, but when we're looking at jiu-jitsu, an increase in muscle hypertrophy has a positive correlation to improved performance as well as improved body composition. This means a reduction of body fat and an increase in muscle mass improves your overall health because that will improve your overall body composition, or what your body is composed of, what it's made up of. Now let's apply this to a practical example in jiu-jitsu. Let's look at the weight divisions when you compete. If you can be at the top end of your weight bracket, but be mostly muscle or have single digit or lower, say between 8 to 12% body fat and more muscle mass, you're going to have a physical advantage over your opponents despite the fact that your weight is the same. If skill is equal, by having more muscle and being stronger than your opponent, it will always be an advantage. There is no benefit to being frail and weak, and there is no downside to being stronger than your opponent. The science behind muscle hypertrophy. This section is by no means a comprehensive overview on the body of scientific literature surrounding muscle hypertrophy and human anatomy. This is simply a surface level, so we have a working understanding. So when we get to the next section, everything comes together. It's not always the case that in order for your muscles to get stronger, that they need to get bigger. However, increasing the size of your muscle inevitably increases your overall strength. So there are ways to get stronger without necessarily stacking on muscle mass. But if you stack on muscle mass, it inevitably comes with an association of increased strength. And this is applicable to the general population. Muscles are generally getting weaker and smaller as you age. So by focusing in your training programs on muscle hypertrophy, you can slow down this process or even reverse it. But what is hypertrophy? Hypertrophy here means growth. When we're talking about hypertrophy in the context of muscle hypertrophy, all we're talking about is muscle growth. But what is muscle growth? What is hypertrophy? In order for your muscles to grow, there needs to be 3 different stimulus in place. They are 1, stress, 2, tension, and 3, damage. But what is actually going on with the muscle? So a basic way to think about this is when you're lifting weights for muscle hypertrophy, you're damaging your muscle. You're creating stress on the muscle and tension on the muscle, and you're creating micro tears in the filament of your muscle bodies. What happens then is your body triggers a process known as muscle protein synthesis and repairs your muscle. It is that repair process that grows the muscle larger. As a brief overview, there are 2 proteins responsible for the movement of your muscle in your muscle body. They are myosin and actin. Think about myosin as a ropey sort of band, if you will, around your muscle, and actin are little bubbles along that myosin. The myosin reach out and grab and slide actin filament, and that is the sliding filament theory of muscle movement. But for our purposes, let's focus in on myosin. During the process of lifting weights or creating sufficient stimulus through muscle damage, these myosin filaments are damaged. Now, when muscle protein synthesis, or the process of muscle protein synthesis, is triggered in your body creates myosin to repair the myosin in your muscle, and it grows back larger, thicker. Therefore, your muscles become larger. Best practices and how to adapt it to jiu-jitsu training. How heavy do you need to lift for hypertrophy? The range of weight selection for muscle hypertrophy is quite large. This is a bit different to strength. With strength, the heavier you lift, the stronger you get, more or less. With muscle hypertrophy, research has shown that the range is anywhere from 30 to 80% of your 1 rep max. That is a huge bracket. Unlike strength, where you don't want to be lifting till failure, with muscle hypertrophy, research shows that the vast majority of the benefit comes when you're lifting as close to failure as possible. But you don't want to go all the way to mechanical muscle failure because it is very taxing on your central nervous system. It will leave you fatigued, and it affects your ability to complete adequate amount of reps and volume in the exercise program after muscle failure. So you want to basically go all the way up to muscle failure, but stop 1 rep short of true muscle failure. Rep range and weight selection. How do you choose the appropriate amount of weight? Now, I mentioned that you can lift between 30 and 80%. That's sort of how heavy you want to go in reference to your 1 rep max. But what about your actual practical weight selection? And what about our repetition range? Well, I mentioned that you want to be lifting as close to failure. For muscle hypertrophy, the beneficial repetition range has been shown to be anywhere from 6 to 15 plus, depending on the exercise that you're doing. Anecdotally, the 8 to 12 repetition range seems to be the sweet spot for most people. Now, let's talk about weight selection utilizing this repetition range. This is a concept that I like to introduce that I've coined as a repetition ceiling. So with the weight selection, you want to select a weight that allows you to achieve your 1 rep short or muscle failure within that 8 to 12 rep range. So the way that might look is say you're doing 4 sets of 8 to 12 reps on bench press. For your first set at your given weight that you've selected, maybe you achieve muscle failure at 11 reps. The next set, 10 reps, then 8, then 8 again. That would be an appropriate weight selection. However, if, for example, on your first set, you can exceed 12, your second, you exceed 12, your third, you're hitting 12, and then your fourth, you're also hitting around 11 or 12 or so, that would probably mean you're lifting a little bit too light for that repetition ceiling of 12 reps. So essentially, if you can exceed the ceiling of your rep range, you need to increase the weight. And we can use the floor as the same sort of concept. If you can't achieve a minimum of 8 repetitions, then you're lifting much too heavy. But if you're purely wanting to go with the focus of muscle hypertrophy and you don't really mind about whatever repetition range is programmed in your specific program, then as long as you're doing 6 plus, you're in the green. If you're doing around 6, your adaptations to your exercise is going to be more geared toward muscle hypertrophy and strength, whereas on the upper end of the repetition range, closer to 15 plus, your adaptation is going to be more geared toward hypertrophy and muscle endurance. Let's talk about rest times between sets. So the rest time between sets is a minimum of 60 seconds with the maximum of 2 minutes or 120 seconds to keep things consistent. So I recommend a sweet spot between anywhere from 60 seconds to 90 seconds is sufficient recovery in between sets, specifically for hypertrophy training. Now, if we're talking about strength training, we can go a lot higher than that, predominantly in the 2-minute range and even up to 3 or 5 minutes, depending on the style of training and the outcomes that you're after. But for our purposes, for jiu-jitsu athletes training for hypertrophy, 60 to 90 seconds is the sweet spot. This also ensures that we can get our workout in with sufficient volume within that 60-minute time frame. And anything more than 60 minutes, we start to have too much central nervous system fatigue, cortisol levels spike, our testosterone reduces, and we have a whole cascade of negative impact of over fatiguing ourselves when we're working out at a sufficient intensity for too long. Okay, what about lifting tempo? If you've never heard the term tempo when referring to lifting before, it simply means the speed at which you're lifting the weights, or the tempo at which you're lifting the weights. You may have seen a program where it has designated tempo, where it will be written in a number sequence. We can go over that in further detail, but all it means is you read the numbers from left to right in the process of lifting the weight. However, for our purposes, for muscle hypertrophy, so long as you're lifting the weight faster than 8 seconds and slower than about half a second per rep, you're good to go. Anything faster than half a second, you're more entering in the territory of lifting for power, which we will be covering in detail in a future episode. And any slower than that, and we're looking at different adaptations other than muscle hypertrophy. But I will say that by changing your tempo, it can be beneficial. I like to assign tempo for certain exercises that I anecdotally find it more beneficial. An example of that is a Romanian deadlift or a straight leg deadlift. It performs better if you do it at a slower tempo. That's because it creates more tension, time under tension on the hamstrings, and they respond better to that when the exercise is done at a slower tempo. Changing your tempo can also help to break through a plateau. If you've been following the same exercise for a while, maybe you're a seasoned lifter and you've been lifting for a long time, then by changing your tempo, you can introduce a different stimulus and it can help you break through a plateau. And this applies to hypertrophy training as well. Periodization and training cycles. In this section, I'm going to be talking about the length of the program and how it's structured and what a training cycle looks like. So the length of your program will depend on so many different factors, chief among which is your goals, what type of athlete you are, what you're training for, and so many other factors like the primary outcomes of the program, how experienced you are as a lifter, how much volume you're doing outside of the program in terms of jiu-jitsu. For our purposes, for training adaptations specifically for hypertrophy, I recommend that your training program lasts at least 8 to 10 weeks, optimally 12 to 16. And that is known as a mesocycle. What is a mesocycle? Well, when it comes to training cycles, we group things in blocks or periods of time that are known as cycles. The largest block of training is known as a macro cycle, and this can last anywhere from 6 months up to 4 years in the case of Olympic athletes, because they're training for the Olympics that happens every 4 years. So that is their macro cycle. Within that, we have a mesocycle. Usually it's between 12 weeks, 16 weeks, or can be shorter, longer, depending on the training program. This is a mesocycle. This is where we would fit a hypertrophy program into a broader picture of your training cycle for jiu-jitsu. And then within the mesocycle, we have microcycles. This is a week of training, generally speaking, and can change from week to week, or it can be fairly consistent depending on how it's periodized. I recommend following a hypertrophy program for at least 8 to 10 weeks to ensure that you're getting enough time, enough stimulus to create and promote that change before jumping on to a different program with different training outcomes and a different primary goal. But within that 8 to 10 weeks, you can introduce different rep ranges, you can introduce different exercise selection or tempos, and this will keep things fresh so you avoid boredom and can be enough stimulus change to promote greater response to your training. Also, it's important to note that the more trained an athlete is, or the more experienced you are with this style of training, you may need longer time and be exposed to more volume to promote the change that we're after. So depending on how experienced a lifter you are, you may need longer than 10 weeks or 8 to 10 weeks in this case to see any benefit from following a hypertrophy protocol. Adapting a hypertrophy program for jiu-jitsu and exercise selection. Despite everything that I've said and outlined so far, I do not recommend that you follow a bodybuilder style program that you can download off the internet for jiu-jitsu. There's many different reasons for this, but chief among those is the volume. When we look at traditional or common or popular bodybuilding style programs, the split is generally divided into 5 or 6 days. The body parts that are separated by a split, something like shoulder day, an arms day, chest day, back day, or maybe back and bis, chest and tris, all these different combinations, kind of arbitrary. They're generally split between 5 or 6 sessions. This is far too much volume for a jiu-jitsu athlete. By doing 5 or 6 dedicated sessions in the gym, you're going to have a negative interference effect with your jiu-jitsu. Your performance in jiu-jitsu is going to reduce. Your risk of injury on the mat is probably going to increase, and it's going to have a detrimental impact on your ability to get better at jiu-jitsu. That is why I recommend lifting a minimum of 2 times per week and a maximum of about 4 times per week. This allows enough opportunity to get the optimal amount of volume in. It doesn't have a detrimental impact on your jiu-jitsu. 2 days per week is a minimum because that meets our minimum threshold to get the stimulus that we're after. We're after hypertrophy. 2 days per week will achieve that in most people, depending on how trained you are. 4 days is optimal because more volume, more stimulus, more potential for muscle growth. Anything more than that, you should be doing more jiu-jitsu. You shouldn't necessarily be doing more weightlifting. Doesn't make sense. Let's talk about sets and reps. What is the recommendation for the minimum sets for hypertrophy and how many repetitions are we doing? Now, I already spoke about repetitions in the 8 to 12 repetition range. Anywhere from 6 plus is optimal. Anything higher than 15 is, generally speaking, muscle endurance. But in terms of your reps, you want to be lifting to failure. You want to be lifting 1 rep short of muscular failure. But how do sets incorporate into this conversation? Well, research shows that you need 1 to 4 sets to achieve 63% of your muscle hypertrophy. Or otherwise, if 100% muscle hypertrophy or 100% of your optimal muscle hypertrophy is what you could achieve with the maximum volume, then by doing 1 to 4 sets, you'll achieve 63% of that. Now, this number is arbitrary because it will change depending on the individual. If you're very highly trained, you're going to need more sets in or more volume, more stimulus to achieve the same outcome. If you've heard the concept of beginner's gains, it's real. It does exist. And that's because you don't need a lot of stimulus in the beginning to have that adaptation or that muscle hypertrophy. But if you've been lifting consistently 5 days a week, specifically for bodybuilding for 10 years, you're not going to be able to get away with 4 sets per week and expect to continue to grow. But for our purposes, 5 to 15 sets per muscle group per week is optimal. That's it. It's not a whole lot. 15 sets per muscle group is on the higher end, but 5 to 15 as a bracket, as a range. Now, with 2 days per week, we can achieve that 5 sets per muscle group quite easily and split it between the 2 days and still get all of our other work in. That's great. Now, if you have a lot of experience training and you still only want to train 2 days per week, well, we're going to incorporate as many sets in to your training session, keeping it under 60 minutes. And that will definitely still improve your performance, have that protective effect, and not have that wasting of muscle as you age. Okay, let's talk about exercise selection. This is how I recommend you structure your training split and assign exercises to each of your days in your training program. If you're training 2 days per week, do an upper-lower split or a full body workout split. If you're training 3 days per week, do a push-pull legs split or a full body workout. There are some advantages to full body workouts over an upper-lower or a push-pull split, and that is that if you find yourself skipping a day consistently in a push-pull leg split, you may miss out on an entire muscle group, which is detrimental to your muscle balance across your body, for muscle hypertrophy balance, and for your performance. You don't want to be consistently skipping legs, for example. Maybe you're doing a very difficult session in jiu-jitsu that week. You may skip out on the gym so that you're adequately recovered. But if you do that, you're going to be skipping out on legs consistently, so it becomes a bit of a problem. But if you do a full body workout, you're evenly distributing your minimum number of sets throughout your training program, and it's less likely that you're going to skip out on an entire muscle group with a full body workout plan. That is why I generally recommend full body workouts for beginners. They've done research comparing full body workouts to traditional splits, and there is no difference so long as volume is matched. Now, in terms of exercise selection, specifically for the hypertrophy program, I recommend starting your sessions with compound movements. I had the same recommendation in the previous episode when we spoke specifically about strength. So go review that. In short, compound movements incorporate multiple joints, multiple planes of movement, multiple muscle groups. So they're more bang for your buck, and they are exceptionally good exercises for muscle hypertrophy. Now, the rest of the movements built around your primary movement or that compound exercise being the first cab off the rank, all the other movements can be isolation work, or they can be other variants of compound movements. If you're doing a full body program, I recommend splitting upper, lower, push, pull between the 2 days and filling in the rest of the exercises with isolation work. Isolation work, as the name implies, isolates the muscle. In terms of hypertrophy, isolation movements are incredibly effective for muscle hypertrophy. And that is why some bodybuilder programs you'll find are made up entirely of isolation movements, because those movements really do work for hypertrophy. But I also recommend incorporating stability work in the form of unilateral stability exercises. And this is where we're going to target our hypertrophy, but also get jiu-jitsu benefit from it as well, because stability is a very important part of the athletic profile of a jiu-jitsu athlete. So if we can include that in our hypertrophy program, we get 2 for 1. So we're not developing any stability deficiencies. This can be in the form of single leg exercises like single leg deadlifts. We can do single leg glute bridges. For the upper body now, we can talk about kettlebell bottoms up press, stability work for your shoulder, and so many different variations of stability exercises. They are stability exercises, yes, but they're also isolation work in a sense. So we get a bit of both. I also recommend incorporating the core, grip, carry, and rotation superset. I spoke about in detail the concept of core, grip, carry, and rotation, why I grouped them together in supersets in the previous episode. So please review that. As a quick summary, it's because it's very important for your athletic profile as a jiu-jitsu athlete, and they're very commonly neglected in traditional strength and conditioning programs. So I like to put emphasis on it, usually at the end of a workout session. Now, if you were hoping for a laundry list of the best exercises to do for muscle hypertrophy for jiu-jitsu, I'm sorry to leave you disappointed. The reason that I can't just list out a bunch of different exercises is because this is very individual. It'll depend on you as an individual athlete, what the primary outcome or primary goal of that training program is. Recovery. We cannot do an episode on muscle hypertrophy without even mentioning recovery. So if it's the lifting weights that breaks down your muscle, it's your recovery time that builds them back bigger and stronger. Recovery has so many facets to it. It is a very complex conversation. However, there are some commonalities that will cross over between most individuals. I will be doing a dedicated deep dive episode on recovery for jiu-jitsu athletes in the near future, so keep an eye out for that. But as a rapid fire, prioritize sleep, prioritize quality nutrition, specifically adequate protein and carbohydrates. Avoid cold exposure 4 hours post-training. So don't get in any ice baths or cold plunges or anything like that. And try to have at least 24 hours in between your sessions. And don't do any endurance cardio within 24 hours of your hypertrophy training to avoid the negative interference effect that may occur. Summary. Okay, so we've gone through quite a lot, but hopefully at this point, it has been understandable and digestible. Let's go through a rapid fire summary on everything that we've covered so far. Increasing your muscle size is all about inducing 3 stimulus. 1, stress. 2, tension. And 3, damage. Increasing myosin increases your muscle size. Train to failure, or at least train until 1 rep short of true muscle failure. For weight selection, you can lift within 30 to 80% of your 1 rep max. Do 5 to 15 sets per muscle group, but 4 sets will get you around 64% of muscle hypertrophy. Your lifting tempo doesn't really matter as long as it's not slower than 8 seconds. Rest between sets should be between 60 and 90 seconds. Make sure your program runs for at least 8 to 10 weeks. You can do full body workouts, upper lower splits, push-pull legs, as long as you're doing a minimum of 2 sessions per week. Where do you go from here? If you want a done-for-you hypertrophy program specifically designed for jiu-jitsu athletes, check out BJJ Jacked. This is my hypertrophy program that's only available on BJJ Strong Online. What is BJJ Strong Online? It's the ultimate performance platform for grapplers. Check it out. Link is in the description of this episode. Reduce your risk of injury, improve your performance, and get jacked for BJJ.